My issue is the one of identity. Because if you're going to say we're going to have policing by people who should be held accountable to the standards that we create, and the countries that we've talked about, there are standards there. When they don't carry those standards out, how can you say it was person A, officer A, if you can't identify them? And I'm not even overly worried about the face mask. I don't like it personally, but the one thing I am not okay with is them carrying identification. Number one, their organisation. Number two, their badge number and their name. Some identifying factor that can be trusted so that when there is an interaction, witnesses can say, Officer Smith, badge number 1234, was the one who behaved in this way. Because without that, if you can't have identifiability, how can you have accountability? It's a nonsense.
Welcome back, everyone. This week's episode is going to be a little bit of a darker tone. We do try and stay fairly upbeat and apolitical on this pod, but sometimes things happen that kind of force us to take a different direction. I want to take you back to when I was growing up as a teenager, and me and my best friend, we used to fantasize about leaving the UK, heading to the US, and first joining law enforcement, and then with the aim of eventually joining the FBI. The FBI was like a mythical organization to us at that time. It was hyped by the media, and it was in our psyche as the apex of law enforcement, and we couldn't wait, we couldn't work hard enough to get there. However, events of late have kind of made me contrast that position to where we are right now. I also look at ICE and the deaths of Rene Good and Alex Pretty and numerous others. I look at videos of very questionable arrest and detention procedures. I see some very questionable doorstep activity. And it kind of, as someone who has been proud of their police service and proud to serve with others in the police service, I see almost everything that can be done wrong being done wrong, in my personal view. And so I talked to Howard and said, okay, maybe is this something we want to get into? Is this something we want to talk about? So this isn't going to be a critique of any particular organisation. But what we thought a good thing and a more helpful thing to do would be is to perhaps revisit some of the basics of what makes British policing so highly regarded. We're going to talk about something called the Peelian principles. If we get time, we're going to try and go into the Office of Constable. So stay with us, because basically we're just going to go through what makes the British police special and stand apart. Howard?
Yes, hello everybody. I too watch with disappointment, shame, concern at events, not just in the US with ICE, but with so-called police law enforcement agencies, because they're not all police forces, they're not all the same, around the world in the way that they interact with the communities that they were created to serve, when they were created to serve communities, because some are not. They are created to serve the state, whatever that may be. But even so, let's not say for a moment, and I speak after 34 years in policing globally, but as a UK police officer, although it may be highly regarded, the UK police service is by no means perfect. There have been institutional failings, there have been management failings, there have been individual failings, both internal to those organisations and external to the communities that they serve. But it's important that those failings, we acknowledge that they are going to happen. It's human nature, things go wrong. But how you deal with when they go wrong, how you police that process is critical to how you were perceived. And the first thing that happened in the UK that goes back to the Middle Ages, you talk about being old, was that they created something called the Office of Constable. And this is a person in society who was given power over other people to police them, control how they behaved and what they did. And that started way back in the Middle Ages. I can point you to legislation in the 12th century in the UK, creating the offices of High Constable. Now, these constables, let's not make a mistake, at that time, they actually worked not for the community, but for what you might call the elite, the governing forces, the lords and ladies of the land, the kings and queens. They weren't servants of the public. They were there to control the public for the benefit of the elite. And that's where they started out. And what was the big change was that this simply didn't work. As people developed as a society in the UK, and they started to think about people's rights and the rights of the common man and all people being equal, these kind of good versus evil evolutions, and they were evolutions. It wasn't until the 18th century that we started to see changes in how society would accept people to govern it or to have control over it. So what happened was, through a series of commissions in 1829, we had a number of bodies in UK governance led by a gentleman called Sir Robert Peel, who came up with a document after a load of planning and consultation called the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829. And that created the Metropolitan Police, which were the first, what you might call, new model police service in the UK. There were other police forces before that on things like for shipping and canals and customs and certain local trades. This was in the Industrial Revolution. So you had mines police, you had steelworks police. They weren't working for the community, they were working for the owners of those businesses to make sure that products were being turned out. So, Peelian principles, they're called that, but really it's slightly unfair in that Robert Peel was just one of many involved in these debates and discussions, contributing ideas. But he became the first police commissioner, hence the fame and fortune and us calling them that now. He actually came up with 9 different principles, but 2 are what I would call key. And the first one is the biggest one of all. And it says, he said it himself, quote unquote, "The police are the public and the public are the police." In the UK, every police officer is not a member of the military. They are a member of the community that they police. So they are civilians, not military. Secondly, that for them to do their job, because of this, we are part of the community, their powers are given to them and are wholly dependent on the public themselves approving and supporting their actions. That's a really key principle. These days it's often referred to as policing by consent. When I used to go out as a police officer and speak to a member of the public, the expectation was not that they would do what I said because I said it and I had power, but because they consented to giving up that power to me and people like me because they'd created the law. I was one of them, just charged with a particular duty. That's a really good place to start in terms of ethics and respect and appropriate behaviour and being independent, not biased in any way or serving any particular group. The second Peelian principle was that, well, what's the primary mission of these people? Well, the mission was actually to prevent crime and disorder, not just to repress it or to punish it after the fact, but actually to prevent it happening and protect the public. So then you're in this situation of why the police are there, and you'll see it all over the world these days, to protect and serve. They're there to serve the public and to protect the individual members of the public from other people in society who are breaking societal norms and wrongs. I know these days it gets very complicated, but that's the real essence of what I consider to be good policing. It holds these people to a professional standard of behaviour. Every member of the public is entitled to expect every police officer to meet at least that standard and all the other 9 Peelian principles as a minimum standard. We can go beyond it and be even better, but there's a minimum standard of behaviour there that's unique to those people. In terms of the actual detail of the 9, I'll just touch on them. I'm not going to go into them in great deal because I don't think it really serves a purpose. The Peelian principles themselves, bearing in mind that they were documented in the mid-1800s, used the language of that time, so a little bit verbose. But the UK Policing Service follows those to this day. They were codified in the early 2000s in what is now the UK Policing's Code of Ethics. And that has the same 9 principles under 9 headings that use language that we'd be more familiar with. If you want to look at Peelian principles' actual wording, it's all over Google, Wikipedia, you can find it. But the 9 principles taken from the UK Code of Ethics, Policing Code of Ethics, are accountability, fairness, honesty, integrity, leadership, objectivity, openness, respect and selflessness. Now show me in any one of those where you're describing well, this is how they will arrest somebody, or this is the crime. The actual law doesn't matter. All these principles are about how those individuals behave in their role as constables towards every other member of society. And they are, I would say, good standards of behaviour for any human being who's going to be part of any society, be it police officer or not. So they don't go into, you must arrest somebody for a burglary, you must arrest somebody for speeding, or murder is wrong. That's a different issue. That's just the law of the land. But if you come across a police officer, those 9 principles are what you have a right to expect in the UK. And if they don't meet those standards, they will be examined and will be punished for failings.
I think that's a great place to get the conversation started. I think you were quite right. I went straight into essentially putting the UK police on a pedestal. But you were quite right to qualify that. You're quite right to say the UK policing is fraught with all sorts of issues. It is by far from perfect. I think what I should have alluded to and made more effort to describe is that there is a history of change. So it's fair to say that, yes, I may be quite proud of certain aspects of British policing. I think it's when you recite the Code of Ethics or the Peelian principles, I think they're a cornerstone of what makes British policing important. But you're quite right. There's lots of things in British policing that we shouldn't be proud about. And there's been lots of changes and lots of evolutions. And it's interesting that you pointed to essentially the Office of Constable, and you think just about the 12th century. So we're literally talking about something that has taken centuries to achieve. And what I would argue has happened over those centuries, and not for altruistic because we did the right thing reasons, but for maybe as a result of political unrest or political pragmatism, what's happened is, I would argue the following. I would argue that no matter where you are on this earth, the word police can mean very different things. And in this country, we've made a kind of progression. I would say if you go to countries where the term police is a derogatory one, where the police are a force for bad more than they are for good, it might be, as our friend Constantine reminded us recently, the police are in it for themselves and the state, and it's more about corruption. I remember quite keenly when I was growing up, both my mum and my dad lived in different parts of the country. My mum lived in Glasgow. My dad was in Wakefield, in the north of England. He would routinely tell me stories of when he worked at a bakery, a police sergeant coming round on a morning, and basically this arbitrage of he'd turn up with some cakes or some other goods from some other places and say, okay, what can you give me for this? This whole kind of second black market that was going on. I've heard stories from the Scottish police where basically members of my family who were involved would have to stay with their prisoner over the weekend for fear that if they got back to the station over the weekend, somebody would have beaten up their prisoner. And these are just some of the vast numbers of horror stories. But to come back to my central point is I think when you are a police officer or even a police staff member, essentially you have one of 3 bosses, and it's all about the ratio of who you serve. You can serve the public, you can serve yourself, or you can serve the state. And I think when we see good police and we see bad police, I think we see those different mixes of those ratios. So when you listed off the Code of Ethics and you were going through them, I think it's important to recognize that different countries are at different places on their journey because, in some respects, policing is an articulation of where that public is with their own state. And that's a really difficult thing to manage. And that sometimes it takes centuries to resolve. That's not to suggest that it's going to take the US centuries to resolve, but I do see what's happening in the US. And actually what I see is I've got very many US law enforcement friends and colleagues who I'm proud to call my friends and my colleagues. And I think they look at the same material I do and just shake their head and say that this thing about progression, and it could be just as valid in the UK, is we can have standards, but progression isn't guaranteed. You can have regression. And I think that's what we're seeing now. I think in some circumstances, we're seeing standards, not just slip would be a euphemism. We're seeing the abolition of standards. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. I agree with you. In the UK, I think that this generation this migration, this evolution of policing to this policing ideal didn't come about because of the elite giving up power willingly and thinking this is for the greater good. I think it's because society's got more power in terms of having a more equal round table. It never would be equal. There are always, shall we say, winners and losers in life. That's just how life is. But it was a a levelling up, if that can be ever a simple term. But I also think, like you said, it can go the other way. Personally, and I speak as a police officer from the UK who's been retired for just over a decade. In my view, and I've stayed working with the police right up until the current day, training them and also observing how they behave and commenting on them, I think policing in the UK is going backwards. And I think a lot of that is not because the police themselves as organisations wish to revert to some other model, but they reflect society. And the design of the UK police was, we'll reflect society. And what they meant was, if there are a certain proportion of men and women or people of different races, people of different social class, people from different communities, different religions, we'll make sure that we, as the police service, have a representative number of those people in our organisations. That way we, as individuals, we are representing our society. That's not always possible, but it's a pretty good ideal to have. But I think as the British state has fallen under globalism and political control and returning to the idea of billionaires and oligarchs and state-run organisations, policing is dragged along with that, whether it be a willing or unwilling partner. In my service, when I first joined the police, and all forces were the same, we had police authorities. So every local area of the 40 or so territorial forces in the UK would have a police committee, and this would be drawn from the community. There'd be magistrates, local dignitaries, people from the legal profession, bank managers, commercial local managers, local councillors, you name it, but a fairly representative cross-section of the local people. And they would select their chief constable, and they would control the budget for the police in their area. So there was that local link that kind of came out of the Peelian principles. And then they changed it. A political decision by politicians, and these weren't political groups before this, created police and crime commissioners. And this was a political group that said, right, we'll get rid of these committees and each area will just have one person to make all these decisions. And that person will be elected by a vote of the public, just like a politician. But we were told at the time, they won't be political. I mean, you can't, at least when you have a committee making decisions, there's a chance for diversities of views to be represented and diverse interests to be more fairly presented. If you put it in one person's control, you suffer the risk of it being biased to that one person's perspective, be it good or bad. But they did that, promising that these wouldn't be political. Within days of these police and crime commissioners being elected, one per police force area, with the same power to choose the chief constable, to control the budgets in the local area. In the UK, we have two main political parties. Each one of those political parties formed a subgroup of police and crime commissioners who were also a member of one political party and police and crime commissioners who were a member of the other. So straight away, you created a division in the political control of the police forces. Police never asked for it. Police never wanted it. Society didn't want it. This was the hierarchy taking control. And I think that's the point. The police is always a servant of society's directions and desires. And if society gets it wrong in its own forward-thinking or control plans, the police service becomes a victim of that, good or bad.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. People might think, well, hang on, we start this pod with principles, like ethical principles. Does the kind of the governance and the politics really matter? What we're trying to explain to a non-police audience is, yes, it does. And it does for the following reasons. Our recent talk with Constantine, he highlighted a very key point that essentially who pays the police is an important factor if it's central government versus local government. And I would argue, in addition to that, it's about who pays the police and who sets the agenda. In what you've just described, we've gone from a model where policing was locally bound. The local chief constable, the local municipality, the local kind of community leaders. It was very locally focused. Central government is at arm's length and is not really involved in the process. So in some ways, the community is getting the best of that local community's interests served. And what we're seeing is the more you politicize policing, the more risks that it becomes centrally linked. And if you get to a point where it's almost like a federal model where your police officers are centrally controlled from the centre, you're going to get a very different outcome. I mean, I actually also want to pick on something you said, which is, I know you were talking about reflections of society, but also it's also reflect on austerity damaged the UK policing massively. And I would argue that was one of the biggest broadsides UK policing had, just from sheer numbers. I think it was 30,000 cops I think we lost over a certain time. And God knows how many police officers and how many staff we lost over that time frame. I would argue the second broadside to UK policing was probably the introduction of the policing degree and the abolition of the forced training schools and things like that. I mean, you were part of that system. That's got to have had an impact, right? Because, and I'm not suggesting for one second that there wasn't room for improvement prior to the policing degree, but I would argue that I'm not entirely sure that the introduction of the police degree and the university training structure was the best way of addressing that problem.
That's a different topic for another day, and I could speak for hours on it. Obviously, I did it. I was part of that process. What I would say is police officers historically learnt their trade from other police officers who were experienced on the ground. So how to deal with people. And the best way to learn about dealing with people is face to face, not from a textbook, from a university course, from a computer screen, or from the behind the window of a police station building with a radio. You need to get up front and personal, because life is up front and personal. I don't mean to be awkward, but one of the things you said earlier on, I disagree with. You said the police serve three masters: society, the managers, and the state, basically, correct?
Society, their community, themselves, and the state. In a ratio. Different police forces, different police do it in different ratios.
I disagree with you completely. Now, this might sound really altruistic. Every police officer in the UK still, regardless of rank, and whichever police force you work for, you're a constable. There are people who are constables who don't even get paid. They are voluntary police officers. They give their time for nothing because they care. Constable is an officer of the Crown, bearing in mind we are a society that has a royal family. I was paid locally. I was employed locally. But my office wasn't the chief. It wasn't directly the local community. It was actually the Crown. And the Crown in this instance meant the law. So I was there to ensure that the law and its provisions were applied fairly and impartially and with respect and honestly and ethically to my local community. And sometimes with police discretion and this direct human contact to knock the rough edges off the law, because the law can be quite a blunt instrument. Life isn't blunt. Every situation is different. Even if we're all doing the same thing, people do the same thing for different reasons and with different justifications. And if you can't be human with people, then you aren't a society. You might as well just all be robots. You don't need police officers. The kind of the same with doctors and nurses. That human contact can never be replaced by a machine trying to diagnose you. You need that human interaction, is my view. So I was an officer of the law. But one of the other things I'd say, Mark, is the British or the English police have it easy. There are only 40 or so territorial police forces and then 2 or 3 others that do specialist services like the rail networks, the military, and the nuclear energy sites. Every single one of us holds the same power. I don't need to go and apply to a court to carry out work outside my local area. And, all this idea, you see the Americans where they drive to the state line and then the state cops have to ring ahead and get somebody else. I don't have to do that. I didn't. I could cross those boundaries because I was an officer of the English law, not an officer just of, in my case, West Yorkshire, or the state, the county that I worked in. But I was a police officer. There are other officers working for the government. There are tax officers who collect tax. They aren't police officers. There were customs duty inspectors. They're not police officers. There were the military. They're not police officers. There were loads of special investigation units, not police officers, not constables. They didn't carry the same duties that I had. Take that around the world, and I've been very lucky to work with police forces and law enforcement agencies globally throughout my career and even now. Last time I counted, I think something like just over 50 countries I've worked in. And the first thing you notice, what they call police are not what we call police. I have been to countries where the police are military. They are drawn from the military. They have military command. They work for the state. They're not police officers. I've been to countries where there are police forces for different things. Religious police. What the heck are the religious police? They are a separate unit designed by that country and that culture to police religions.
state police, I'd argue.
Yes, that's where the state and religion are combined. But you see how the idea of what's a policeman? In England, if you saw a police officer walking down the road in my day, they had the silly hat, the uniform, a whistle, a truncheon, and they all looked the same, and the expectation was they'd all treat you the same. The first time I ever went to America, I went to Texas and for training, and I was made very welcome there. But I was in a local police training college where there were other officers from other police with a small p agencies. And you're getting to know people, and it's like aliens meeting almost. You imagine a fat boy from Wakefield turning up in the back of Beyond in Texas. We were as weird to them as they were to us. And apart from the things like carrying arms routinely and things like that, I was trying to understand policing locally. And we totted up that just in that area of Texas, you could, on the same street in the same town in Texas, be stopped by one of 33 agencies who were law enforcement. There might be road highways, there might be state, there might be local police, there might be sheriff's department, there might be FBI or some federal agency. So they all look different. They all work for different people. Some are state or federal, some are state, some are local, some are specialists. None of them you would recognise as police. Where in the English, uniform, the term uniform, one form, it makes you recognisable. If I lived in America, and I know we're probably going to talk about ICE and this idea of no badges and no numbers to identify individuals, I'd even struggle to identify what police officers were versus, I don't know, mall police, whatever they call them, or traffic wardens, meter maids. Because lots of people, the post office, telephones, wear uniforms. Private businesses wear uniforms. Security staff do. How do you know which one's a police? And how do you know which agency has the right to control you in that area? What I'm saying is complex structures all work against this idea of policing to be a common standard where you can have trust. If I was in Texas, it may be that I thought Department A or Organisation A were completely trustworthy. Every time I dealt with them, they were first class, they were ethical, respectful, fair, everything else. And Agency B weren't. But how would I know which was which? Because by the time I'd worked out who was who, you don't know who to trust and where they're coming from.
I get that. I actually think you agree with me more than you think, because I think, and I may have done a bad job of explaining it. When I was talking about the public, the state, and the individual, I'm saying that any police officer in any country, in effect, when you do something, I think you are serving one of those three agendas ultimately, because I would argue that the UK is quite an obscure thing, because you are right. Our authority ultimately resides with the king, but that was extended, and you and I both know in both of our careers, there was never any royal intervention in what we were doing beyond the royal commissions or something like that.
It's a legal fiction.
Yes. And all of our case. Yeah.
It's not a bad idea to have for an altruistic concept. The point I was making, yes, we do serve those people, but if the idea is I serve a higher ideal, the crown and the law, rather than these individuals, if what they are telling me to do conflicts with those principles, I have a duty, not just the right, the duty I am expected to put them first. And that translates very, very easily for me to all the situations we're seeing on social media in other countries right now. And when it happens in our country, it happens here as well.
Yes.
I watch that kind of action and think they're doing what politicians want, or they're doing what local groups want, or some party, they're representing somebody, but what they are not representing is their duty to their office and to their oath of office. And I know that some of the agencies, whether or not we call them police, in these countries have similar oaths of office. In America, they talk long and hard about the Constitution. Boy, oh boy, for a country that so prides itself on its Constitution and its freedom and its concepts of respect, but like British policing being a concept, I see an awful lot of, me as an outsider, people who are completely ignoring what it says. It's like Christians who say, I'm a Christian, I follow the 10 Commandments. Do you? Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill. But, well, there's no but in it. Those are the principles. You either follow them or you don't. You can't claim one and both at the same time.
Yeah, and that's the point I'm alluding to, which is the things that I see in some circumstances. When you slap the cuffs on, or when you discharge your weapon and kill someone, I would argue there's a question to be asked. which agenda is being served. Are you protecting the community? Are you serving a political or perhaps personal agenda? Are you just doing it because you want to? Is it just, is it a case of a limbic system going crazy and, we all get angry and all the rest? And I think that's what I would say that I think is one of the good points about British policing is we have centuries of history, but also lots of getting it wrong, where we've gone back and said, okay, so that this bad thing doesn't happen again, in future, we will have the Peelian principles, the code of ethics, and I totally appreciate that different countries have different circumstances. And we talk about, me and Pony have talked about this a lot, about how, the whole, why aren't UK police officers armed versus the US? I think, in the US, the genie's out of the bottle, right? There's a number of guns is astronomical, and to expect the police in the US to go unarmed would be crazy. That being said, there are some differences in the UK, and in some aspects the UK may have it in more dangerous circumstances.
I agree with that. Armament is not the issue. All police officers are armed. One of the things I used to ask my students is, what do you think the most important tool is in your armoury? And some would say my truncheon, my handcuffs, the power of arrest, or a gun, or pepper spray, body armour. And I would say, no, the most powerful thing is the office that you hold, because that interferes with people's minds. If you challenge somebody with a gun, there's always going to be somebody with a bigger gun or a better shot. You can't trade equality of arms. But when you're talking about right and wrong, and you're saying, this power of office says, I am here to serve the common good, you might end up being a martyr for that. And unfortunately, that's the risk that we all take in the job that we love. That's the contract, kind of like the military. You might get hurt, but that's the choice that you make to serve society. The other thing I would say is you talk about armament. For me, that's not the big issue. If any country wants to let its citizens run around with guns, that's up to them. The less guns there are, the less people will get shot. That's just common sense. That you can hide behind religion, constitutional rights, legal rights, whatever you want. But as a father, a grandfather, a husband, a son, a family man, a community man, I've seen firsthand the impact of weapons being used on human beings. And it's not nice. And most of the times it's used, there could have been some other way of dealing with that instance, which had a gun not been there, or a knife, or whatever the weapon was, the outcome would have been less fatal. It wasn't a must-have. But what I would say is, that's not my issue with those countries and those forces. My issue is the one of identity. Because if you're going to say, we're going to have policing by people who are should be held accountable to the standards that we create, and the countries that we've talked about, there are standards there, may not be exactly the same as ours. Some are very close, some aren't. But there's some standards. The first thing is, when they don't carry those standards out, how can you say it was person A, officer A, if you can't identify them? And I'm not even overly worried about the face mask. I don't like it, personally, but the one thing I am not okay with is them carrying identification. Number one, their organisation. Number two, their badge number and their name. Some identifying factor that can be trusted, so that when there is an interaction, witnesses can say, Officer Smith, badge number 1234, was the one who behaved in this way. Because without that, if you can't have identifiability, how can you have accountability? It's a nonsense. And that's the big thing. I mean, I've noticed with great interest, you're going to talk about ICE, and I get that. And I've known that organisation for many years. I have former colleagues who worked in it, who I consider to be good agents. I do not consider them to be police officers. They aren't there for all policing. They're there for a single purpose: immigration control and enforcement. That's not policing. That's an element of societal control, kind of like customs. So, one, they're not police. That means they shouldn't be held to police standard accounts. I'm not saying they shouldn't be held to some kind of accounts, but it's not fair to judge them against that. But what I have noticed, and I'm not making a case for them in any way, shape or force, but in recent times, have you noticed how where previously most of them, the badge would say ICE, notice how many of them now it says police ICE. Well, which are you? ICE is a federal organisation. Most policing authorities in America are not federal. You've got the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but the rest are not police. CIA is not police. Homeland Defence are not police. They might be law enforcement, but they're not police in the Peelian principles way. Does that make sense? So there's this, they're getting blamed as police officers when they're not police officers. They're federal agents carrying out a function of government. There could be any untrained, unethical Joe. So when we're expecting them, I'm not saying we shouldn't complain about how they behave. Christ, we should.
Yeah, no, I don't want to disagree with you, but I think there's something you've not taken into account, which is I think you are. So let me explain via a very bad analogy. But do you remember when the Serious Organised Crime Agency came into being, or the National Crime Agency? They're the same thing, right?
Yeah.
In the UK, and basically when they're normally in plain clothes, but when they're doing arrest warrants or other outdoor activity, they will have, different gear on that will say police, even though they're not the police. And your point about them not being the police, being the federal thing, is that I think you and I may have a slightly romanticized and idealistic view of what the good police looks like, and I'll get to that in a second. But I think from a member of the public's point of view, they don't have the demarcation that's in your head, right? So they can't tell if it's I recognize and agree with your point that I am disturbed when I see ICE and police on the same body armour, if you like, or the same armband. What does worry me, though, is I would argue that if we just take policing to mean law enforcement in the broadest possible sense, because I think that's how people experience it. When you get a knock on the door from the state, be it the local state or the central state, they are still law enforcement, right? I would argue that good policing happens, or good law enforcement happens, when there's a tension between liberty and security. And I think what worries me about this, and your points about identification are valid, I actually do think, I do wonder, as far as I'm aware, and when I've spoken to other colleagues about this, people who work in serious and organised crime, when they do very specific arrest warrants against very high-risk targets, of which there is going to be blowback, that's usually the threshold for disguise. Because I would argue that when law enforcement has to put a disguise on, there has to be a pretty good exception. I think you have to, but when you're just grabbing people out of restaurants, or you're pulling people out of cars who've just dropped their kids off at school, whether or not you're going to shoot them or not, the mask isn't a tactical consideration, really. It feels like it's more of a security.
Absolutely.
It feels like it's a tactical, you're trying to get a tactical advantage by appearing imposing.
For me, it's doing two things. One, it's designed to intimidate the public, what the Americans always, modern times we call cosplay. They're all over-armoured and bunched up. They look like something out of one of these shoot-'em-up games. That, for me, just invites disrespect, because any professional gun carrier, military or similar, would look at these people and laugh, the same as a police officer. I look at these quasi-police organisations that we see from time to time, and I laugh because they may look the same to the public, but to me, they stand out like a sore thumb. The other thing you mentioned were the organisations in the UK, Serious and Organised Crime Agency and the SIA. What I would say to you is those organisations arose as an evolution from something called the National Crime Squad and the National Criminal Intelligence Service, and those themselves arose from regional crime squads and regional criminal intelligence services. Now, the officers in the regional teams and the national teams, when it was a National Crime Squad, I was one. I was a police officer. So I carried a badge for the National Crime Squad, but my badge of power was my police officer's constable's warrant card from my home force. So although I was working for a national agency, police Peelian ethics and my core role still governed that. And it's not the case as much now, but I think you'll find with a lot of those agencies, they have very similar codes of ethics to the police code of ethics, because they've evolved as national representatives of those local and regional organisations. I can't say that that's the same in the US. I don't have the competence to comment on that. But I think that's the point. Regardless of where the organisation it comes from, or officer or not, police officer as Howard would view it from a common sense point of view, what are their codes of ethics? How do they operate? And if you can't even identify them on the street, how do you know which one of these 37 organisations' codes of ethics even applies? It's designed, I would say, politically, to confuse members of the public.
Yeah, and I think that's my concern is if I'm walking down the street and a van screeches behind me and a bunch of guys jumps out, the uniform is important to a certain degree, isn't it? Because they're in plain clothes and potentially in balaclavas. That can mean very different things, especially in certain other countries. But if your demarcation between centralized UK law enforcement agencies, and I totally get that when you were doing it, you had two hats, right? You were still a local police officer, but acting in a regional or national context.
Yes.
That does raise the question when we have separate central government agencies who aren't also police officers, that's a separate, they can't double hat.
Even when I worked abroad, I was still employed as a UK police officer. I was on secondment, I was on loan, but I was a UK police officer 24/7. 365 days a week from the day I swore my oath and accepted my warrant to the day I retired. There's not an hour of the day, even when you're off duty, when you haven't got the legal requirement of meeting that standard. And I'm proud of that. I myself, I am sure, didn't meet the standard all the time, but it was my governing principle, and I'd rather fail from a very high standard occasionally than succeed occasionally from a very low standard. I think the first position is a healthier one for the public, the community and the customers of this service than the other. The other thing is, it's all right having the rules, but what happens when you don't enforce them? In UK policing, if you transgress those rules, there are processes and standards for you to be demoted, to be fined, to be punished, to even lose your job, and to go to court and be convicted of criminal civil offences without the protection of being a police officer. I believe that's right and proper, coming back to the police of the public and the public of the police from Robert Peel's time. But we look at what's going on elsewhere in the world, and if there are no checks and balances or no ways to enforce the checks and balances, what's the point of having checks and balances? It's just PR.
No, 100%. I want to pick up on something else you said, which is, you mentioned you had friends and colleagues who were from ICE years ago. Likewise, I suspect you and I have got both people from the FBI side and other law enforcement agencies. I think it's important to recognise that's the problem, isn't it? Is that when we say the word police or FBI or NCA, these organisations change over time. I remember when I joined your team many years ago now, and this is going to make you sound more tyrannical than you were because you didn't say it in this way, but I'm not going to do you justice. But you basically said that we have to focus on getting things right, because you said that the reputation for the team and the department is built over years, but lost in a minute. And it takes years to get it back. And that kind of stuck with me, and that kind of makes me think about these organisations, because they do build reputations over time and hopefully in some cases build a positive one, but you can undo years, decades of good practice in a single video, in a single incident. And I think that's when I look at the things that are on social media right now, and I see, like say, alleged arrest procedures, alleged doorstop activity, I see things that I think would make the same professionals in those same organisations cringe from 10 years ago. And when I talked about the state, the self, and the king, that's what I'm trying to get at is when I'm watching these videos online, and there's always, I tend to find on social media, there are two types of police video. There is the police on a pedestal video of a cop putting themselves in harm's way and dealing with the situation. Or there's the mockery video where basically at the police, watch the police officer fall over. Where we focus on the police use of force or the police doing something that's quite dramatic and quite life-altering, I think it's important to ask the question at that time, when they have grabbed somebody, when they have hit somebody, when they've used force, are they serving themselves? Are they serving the community? Or are they serving the king or the state? And because I think in a number of these incidents that have you and I and others worried, I would argue that some of the operators on the ground, they may really feel that they are serving the state. They may feel they are serving the community, but actually in some circumstances, they might be serving themselves, and they perhaps got a misunderstanding of which community they're serving. And I think that's the tension that, and I think that all of those issues are resolved by the things you described, by the code of conduct, identifiable police, identifiable law enforcement, high standards. But the other thing to bear in mind is the UK has got a very long track history of, we go to great lengths when force and violence is used. As I understand it, whenever a firearms officer discharges their weapon, they're immediately suspended pending an investigation. And it seems overly bureaucratic and difficult. But what we're saying is that we always seem to interrogate the use of force as far as possible. And yes, that's not perfect, and there's professionals have fallen foul of that. But I think that's an important counterweight to the inappropriate use of force.
It is, and what really stands out, I used to carry a firearm. Let me qualify that. I was an authorised firearms officer. I didn't carry one all day, every day, but I went through the training to carry a gun and did so on occasion. Operationally, I mean, not for fun. There are different levels of gun permits and so on and so forth. But the basic one was always that the police officer, the person carrying the gun, was uniquely and solely the one person who was responsible for firing that gun and the consequences of any discharge. So no matter that, in my case, I was part of a 10,000 plus police force, and I had the English law, I had the protection of the Police Federation and all these other things behind me. If I shot somebody or I discharged my weapon, the only person who had to explain that was me. So regardless of political or other pressures on me, it really focuses your attention when you're staring down the barrel of a gun at somebody who, and we were only ever trained at my level to shoot to kill. All this cowboy nonsense of shooting to wound. There are certain elite levels of firearms that can do that. But the average Joe, and I was an average Joe, are trained to double tap, bang, bang, shoot and kill, because you can't trust to just winging somebody, and shooting somebody just to try and temporarily disable them, even when that's your only weapon. Chances are it's a bad idea. You're more likely to kill them than not. So when you're in that situation, it's actually very good to be able to focus and think, the only thing I need to worry about is why am I doing it? Not the politics, not what the bosses will think, not what my colleagues would think, but if I shoot this person, I have to answer to the Crown, this ideal concept of what a policeman should be. I certainly have to answer to the law, and I'm going to get investigated the hell out of. I know that in advance. It's going to be a lonely place. But ultimately, I have to answer to my professional and personal standards of behaviour and ethics. I have to answer to my God, if I'm religious, and to what my partner and my parents and my family and my loved ones think of me. So all the things that I value, what would they think of what I've done? And I watch the actions of some of these people and think, what would your parents or your partners or your children or people that you know think of what you're doing right now? And it can be naive, can that, because not all family groups and not all peer groups think the same, but it's a really good place to be because it's a lonely place. So the reasons that make you do things have got to be important to you. You can't be worried about, I know we've got a quota to arrest 3,000 of these people, whoever the hell they are, and they're wanting to use really strong force because it looks good on the cameras for social media. And I like walking around with a gun on me because I have a small penis and no character. I need something to make me look better than I am. These sad excuses for human beings. They aren't men or women. They are subhuman in my view when they behave like that. They let themselves down as human beings, never mind as representatives of their organisation, their peers and their society. But you get what you pay for, and you get for the way you recruit people. But how can they make that decision? And that was really good for me. I'm very lucky. In my service, I never had to personally shoot somebody, but I have close colleagues who did, and they went through hell. What I have done in my service, I have been in a situation where if I had to put serving the Crown above loyalty to my peers, to my organisation, through formal complaints processes, and it was created career and personal difficulties for me, there were consequences to my career and my health for me and for my family and loved ones. But I won, so my faith in the system, luckily for me, was proven. But it came at a cost. To actually stand up for those standards and to practice what you preach and what you believe, it's not just about shooting somebody. It might be the way you treat somebody in what they call a traffic stop, the way that you speak to somebody at a bus stop, the way that you deal with a homeless person or a victim of crime, or the worst, most ignorant, loudmouth, obnoxious person in public. They are all deserving of respect. And if you don't do that, you have let the system and yourself down. And that's what it makes my heart bleed to see these people doing in the name of policing. And that's what annoys me. They aren't coming out saying, no, we're not the police, we are the military. Fine, let them have never been in the military, so it's not for me to stand up as a veteran and say, what you're doing is wrong. I wouldn't presume on that. Respect where respect is due. I'm a civilian member of the emergency services and an old one. Does that kind of make sense? Ultimately, your values matter. And for me, my professional values were of such a high standard that they met my personal values, but all of that comes at a price. It fit the job I was in. I was the right person for that job, but by heck, it cost me. And I am happy for that cost, because without it, it's just another job. You might as well be stacking shelves.
I think it's really crucial that you talked about principles there. I'm going to read to you something that I'm sure you'll instantly recognise, but I think that some of our listeners might like to hear it. I will serve the King in the Office of Constable with fairness, integrity, diligence and impartiality, holding myself to the highest standards of behaviour and taking pride in serving the public of England and Wales, to safeguard their rights and to protect the communities I serve. Now, I'm sure you recognise that as the oath. I'm pretty sure that's the oath you took. I don't know if it's been rephrased over the years, but is that the oath you took all those years ago?
Almost, but in my case, I took my oath to Her Majesty the Queen, Elizabeth II.
Fair enough.
And all my service medals that I received were from the Queen.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting for that is we've talked about essentially this overlap of the state and authority handed down. But essentially what I've known you for a lot of years, I know you take your oath and your standards very seriously, and you've said they overlap, right? The legal responsibilities placed upon you, but the ones you had already. And I think that's what, as we head towards the end of the recording, I think I would ask any law enforcement officer or agent to consider, even if they've taken an oath or not, what their standards are. What are their red lines? What are the things that truly matter? Who qualifies as community? Who is disqualified from that? Because what worries me about today's world is the world has always been polarized to an extent, but I would argue in generations gone past and decades gone past, we had much more of a shared experience. We often lived and worked and played in the same areas. We had similar housing, similar life experiences, even though we had different views. What worries me now, as people lived more polarized lives and that shared experience evaporates, that we fall into a trap of them and us. Because what I like about the oath and what I like about the code of ethics that you talked about earlier is at their lowest level, it's about humanity, right? It's about people. And I think that's something that law enforcement officers and agents need to focus on.
I agree. And I think they're good standards for human beings, whether or not you're a police officer. In the UK, you could argue every member of the community is a police officer because they all serve these public standards of behaviour they're supposed to. In the UK, if I was attacked or if I was investigating a murder or some serious crime, I would expect and hope that the community would come and help me in either circumstance. I've been very lucky that on most occasions they have. Sometimes they haven't. But just like police officers, they're only human. And the final thing is, the reason I say humanity, it's bigger than the office. I have known very high-ranking, very experienced police officers who I would have not trusted to be in my house unaccompanied or to guard my baby son. And yet I have known criminals, up to and including multiple murderers serving life sentences, and this is when life meant life, who I would have trusted with my baby son and my wife. Folk are folk. There's good and bad in everybody. The danger with creating a societal model is that most societies, if everybody contributes, tend to come up with these same ideas of humanity and respect, wherever you are in the world and whatever culture. The thing that creates the division are the people who want power for themselves or for their group over and above the average member of society. And they're the ones who create division. And I don't care whether it's politics, religion, or business. Whatever the function is, the object is divide and conquer, because that's the route to power. And the only way to combat that is to have a standard of humanity towards not only the people that you like, but more importantly, the people that you don't like or who are different to you or maybe think differently to you. Because if you don't respect them, what moral right do you have to expect them to show you any respect in return?
That's a perfect note to end it on. So thank you for today, Howard. Thank you all for listening. We'd love to hear from you. Please get in touch with the pod if you either agree or disagree or maybe got a different view. We'd love to hear from you. But until next time, all the best. Thanks for listening.